Again, thank you all for coming. I know that we have some returning faces and we have some new faces. And let me just give you a little synopsis of what this program is about and why we do it. The Presidential Lecture Series started about 8 years ago with the purpose of establishing an atmosphere in our institution that stimulates discussion among the members of the CUNY faculty, our students, and the public. It is the goal of the Presidential Lecture Series to raise the public and colleges community awareness of the tremendous intellectual and creative depth of our CUNY faculty. Therefore, the lectures showcase a distinguished professor or a national figure whose work pertains to CUNY in the fall semester, and one of our own Queensborough Community College faculty in the spring semester. Today, we have a lecture by Dr. Jean Murley, who is an accomplished scholar and teacher. And I want the students in particular to take note of the fact that Dr. Murley was a candidate for a PhD and received her PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center. I know that some of you will be doing the same thing in a couple of years. She has a number of fellowships and she has received a number of grants. The book that you see here, True Crimes, 20th Century Murder and American Popular Culture, was nominated for an Edgar Allan Poe Award of Mystery Writers of America. She's also written chapters in the Greenwood Encyclopedia of New American Readings. She has reviewed in the Journal of Popular Culture. She has contributed to another book called Understanding Evil, an Interdisciplinary Approach. And she has presented in numerous conferences on writing across the curriculum in our university and throughout the land. She's a member of Phi Beta Kappa, I almost said Phi Theta Kappa, Phi Beta Kappa, and she has served the college and continues to serve the college as a member of the Middle States Steering Committee, the Honors Conference Committee, the Commencement, it used to be the Commencement Committee, she was a Commencement Marshal, and most importantly, she's a member of the Library Committee. So here is a faculty member, with students, who is not only an accomplished scholar, a fine teacher, but a contributing member of our college community. Before I introduce her and bring her to the podium, I want to thank the members of the Presidential Lecture Committee who have been with me for 8 years now, organizing these very fine lectures. And let me thank, first of all, Dr. Sheena Gillespie, who is the chair of the Faculty Executive Committee and therefore the chair of the faculty at the college, Dr. Peter Gray, Dr. Kenneth Pearl, Dr. Sasan Karimi, and my good friend and colleague, Dr. Dan King. This committee selects the speakers, makes the arrangements, and makes it possible for this lecture series to be what they are. So it is with great anticipation and a great deal of pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Jean Murley.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. And before I start, I would also like to thank Dr. Marti and the Presidential Lecture Series Committee for asking me here today to talk about my book and one of my favorite subjects, which is true crime. Now, before I start, I just want to clear up what may or may not be a misapprehension on your part. People ask me all the time, oh, you write about fiction, oh, detective stories, I love detective stories. That's not what true crime is. I love detective fiction as well, and for you students, I'm going to be teaching a class on mystery and detective fiction in the fall, if you're interested in that topic. But my book is about true crime. That is nonfiction narrative treatments of actual crime, right? So there are fictional techniques involved, but it is essentially reality that we're talking about here, and that's treated in this genre. So the book that I've written began with a set of questions that I had been trying to answer since I picked up my first true crime book when I was a teenager. Those questions are, what are these books? Why are they so popular? And perhaps most importantly, why can't I stop reading this horrifying story? Because these stories are about really terrible things that happen. That have happened to real people. And one thing I want to say before I get started is that in my work, I try to remain sensitive to that fact, and I also try never to trivialize the things that I write and talk about. It is a very serious subject, and the ways that real murders get turned into stories in our mass media in particular are very troubling sometimes, and I also am very critical of the genre itself. So that's a part of what I do. So the book that got me hooked on this genre really was Anne Rule's 1980 book called The Stranger Beside Me. And that book remains a pillar of true crime for many reasons. It was about the infamous serial killer Ted Bundy. Rule had a very personal perspective on the events because she was actually friends with Ted Bundy before she wrote that book. And she sort of codified the conventions of the true crime genre in a way that hadn't really happened before. So I'm going to say a little bit more about the books later on, but I just want to start by giving an overview of what this genre is all about. So there's the book. So just generally, let's think about what is true crime. Like I said, it's not fiction, right? It's nonfiction. My book offers an overview or a survey of the 20th century history of the true crime genre. True crime has changed throughout the century, obviously in form, style, and content, and my book talks about those changes. And true crime largely consists of murder narratives. Some true crime deals with gang activity or organized crime, things of this nature, but by and large, American popular true crime is a murder narrative. It is always dealing with real murder that has actually happened. So what is a murder narrative? Well, it's a nonfiction treatment of real murder, and murder narratives appear in these different forms. They appear as magazines, or they used to. We'll talk about that in a minute. Books, essentially, television programs, particularly now, they're very popular. Feature-length films in various forms, documentaries, fictionalized films, and essentially, a new development has been true crime on the internet. So my book deals with each of those mediums in which true crime narratives appear. So although murder narratives and nonfiction crime writing have a history that spans centuries, modern true crime made its earliest appearance in the pages of True Detective magazine in the 1940s and 50s. True crime is a way of making sense of the senseless, but it has also become a sort of a worldview, an outlook, and a perspective on contemporary American life, one that is suspicious and cynical, narrowly focused on the worst kinds of crimes, and preoccupied with safety, order, and justice. True crime has brought a tabloid sensibility into high culture, and it has illuminated the sordid with beams of truth. In its best exemplars, true crime questions its own motivations and reasons for being. The cultural work of true crime, in its various pop culture manifestations, is important, compelling, and it's my belief that true crime is often misunderstood or ignored entirely because it's seen as a pulp genre. It's very much devalued, and people who are into true crime are often seen as, a little bit off or a little strange. Why do you like reading about that stuff? So my work sort of takes seriously a pop culture genre that a lot of people demean and see as irrelevant. Let's see. True crime does a lot of different things. One of the things that interests me the most is the way that murder stories are told differently according to their historical period. True crime murder narratives reflect the tensions and the preoccupations of the culture that produces them, right? So they both reflect and sort of feed back and inflect that culture. In true crime, we can see vast changes in the way that murder is understood in different time periods. Different eras find varying meanings in acts of murder, leading to various types of representations and narratives. You can barely see that. So the first picture here is Lizzie Borden, and her story has been told, numerous times in so many different ways, and most everybody, except maybe some of the students, knows about Lizzie Borden. She killed both of her parents in 1892 in Massachusetts. Her story at the time was told in a very different way than we understand it now. At the time, she was actually acquitted of the murders because it was believed that a middle to upper middle class young woman was incapable of committing such an atrocious act, right? Of course, there were people at the time who said she's guilty, but the majority of people who were consuming her story in the popular media of the day thought that she just was not capable of doing something like that. People throughout the 20th century have told and retold her story, and different things get added to it all the time, so that now we see varying interesting things about class, social class, and gender in her story, and we see things differently. And she may or may not be acquitted in our culture if she were to be tried again, but the stories that would be told about her in our mass media are very different than the ones that were told at the time about her. So I'm most interested in the way that we change an essential fact or a reality that has happened. A murder happens, and depending on what we think went on or what we find interesting about the victim or the perpetrators or the context, that's the story that the murder is, that the murder produces. So that's essentially my topic, and that's what I talk about in the book, looking at murder narratives in these various forms. The middle slide there is Charles Manson. I'm going to talk about him particularly around films, and the last slide is Ted Bundy. So these are three sort of iconic American murderers in a way, reflecting the different preoccupations of their moment, right? Right now, well, the serial killer moment has sort of turned a bit, and we're not so interested in them anymore, but the 80s and 90s was a sort of high point of mania about serial killers. And of course, the Charles Manson events in the late 60s and early 1970s really altered the way that American, pop culture, I guess, generally looked at and understood the counterculture of that moment. And we'll talk about that more in a minute as well. So the first thing I want to do then is look at some of the true crime magazines, which were the most popular form of murder narration from the 1920s until the 1960s. And paperback books and television effectively killed the true crime magazines because paperback books began to be more mass-produced and cheap. And of course, television killed a lot of different media forms, right? Not just these magazines. So looking at some of the magazines, I just wanted to give you all an overview of them because they're really interesting. And in their pages and their covers, you can see the sort of historical changes that I'm talking about. This cover is from the 1930s. You can see it references Dillinger, right? Notice that there's a man on the cover. In later editions of the magazine, men were not the sole subjects of the covers. We'll see that. But initially the covers were illustrated, obviously, as photography became more developed. Live models were used, but in the early days, and this one is from 1932, in the early days, it was all illustration. There were many different titles, you'll see. This was a spread from one of the stories. The thing that interests me about this is not just the visual sort of iconography, there's a mixture of photographs and illustrations with the skeletal hand coming in. This is about a robbery murder in a bowling alley. Night hides a bloody score, so the sort of the dripping blood off the scorecard of the bowling alley, and the photo of the corpse actually in the back there. That was something that was done in many of these stories. The magazines asked policemen to send in stories and photographs, and they wouldn't print a story that wasn't accompanied by photographs. Usually it was crime scene stuff, but sometimes it was of the actual, the victims. So I think this is a really good slide just to give you an idea of what these stories looked like. And some of you might remember reading the actual magazines. Another thing I wanted to say about this is that as the century went on with the magazines, stories like this fell out of circulation. The culture was just not interested in these rather mundane, robbery, murder kind of stories. It became much more about sex and violence into the 1950s and 60s. This one, I believe, is from the 1940s. Again, some of the illustrations of a story. This wouldn't have been a cover, it was an interior story. And as we get into the 1950s, the image of the femme fatale becomes very important, particularly on the covers. And that's how they got people to buy these magazines. I mean, the stories themselves were not all that interesting. They were, and the people were certainly not beautiful and sexy and attractive, but put them on the cover, with models and illustrations, and, it generated a lot of sales, right? So we see the one in the middle, the woman is sort of, she's fixing a garrote, I think, so that when the guy sits up, he'll strangle himself, I think. It's kind of hard to see that. The wall of eyes, is the woman, is she being looked at or is she looking at us or both? And the one over here, she's literally going to stab him in the back or the neck. At any rate, she's a dangerous woman. This one, the woman is acting as a sort of lookout while her husband or boyfriend holds up the lunch counter guy, right? Again, this would have been from, I would say, the mid-50s, early 50s maybe. This one suggests a kind of secrecy or hiddenness, right? She's either hiding a diary or reading someone else's diary, right? So there was this dramatic reenactment on the covers of some of these crimes. And sometimes the covers had nothing to do with what was in the story itself. It was just an over-dramatization of, maybe some slender detail from the actual crime. As the 1950s and 60s wore on, this kind of quasi-softcore bondage porn became a part of these covers. And that's primarily the reason why you can see these things on the internet now, is because people have collected these and they post the covers of women who are tied up and helpless, basically. Here's another one. This is a true detective from, I believe, the late 60s, early 70s. Terrifying ordeal of Georgia's hostage nurse. That might be that story. Here's one that's very interesting in terms of how it's set up visually. You're looking through a peephole in a door, right? So in the 60s, ideas about watching and being watched played out on these magazines, on the covers in particular. And this one, you know, you're invited to be a voyeur, basically. This is when the magazines start getting into very creepy moral territory. And frankly, in the 70s and 80s, they become pretty disgusting. And I don't really deal with them beyond the early 70s. It was just very clear that they were all about titillation and exploitation of actual crimes that may have contributed to their demise. I don't know. But here we have, you know, a woman posing as the corpse in this case, right? And this one, detective cases, her body was soft, her blood was sweet. You can see where this is going. Are they closing in on Zodiac? Miss Hot Pants meets Mrs. Cold Steel. It just, you know, just goes down from here. It doesn't. This one is interesting because it doesn't reference murder at all. It's talking about 1960s drug culture, right? Through hell on a blue pill. Well, I thought this was about murder, you know? But it's a beautiful cover. I like what they've done with the colorful flames. It's, you know, an acid trip or something, right? That's the magazines. Like I said, they get bad in the 70s, so we won't look at those. Let's move on to books. Let's see what I have to say about the books. You know, Dr. Marti said that I went to the CUNY Grad Center and I wrote my PhD dissertation on true crime books. So this is really my first love, like I told you before, was the books themselves. And the books became very popular and they developed a set of recognizable narrative conventions or rules that writers follow to create them during the 70s and 80s. So the books kind of take over from the magazines and they took some of the narrative conventions, those guidelines or techniques that writers used, they took some of them from what the magazine writers were doing. Some of the major titles in true crime include, of course, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, The Onion Field, Joseph Wambaugh, 1973, Helter Skelter, written by Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecutor of the Manson crimes, 1974, The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer in 79, and The Stranger Beside Me, Ann Rule, 1980. Ann Rule has become the best-selling true crime writer in the world. She is just a powerhouse. She's well into her 70s now, and she's still churning out a book a year. She's amazing. She was coming to New York 2 years ago, but she got ill, and I hope to meet her someday. She's a wonderfully warm person. I've corresponded with her. She's great. She's a great person. She has sort of feminized the genre in terms of dealing with cases apart from some early books, and this one in particular that dealt with serial killers. She's become much more interested in presenting victim stories, which appeals to me as well. And she doesn't see herself as a feminist, but she definitely writes for women. The narrative conventions of this genre include these aspects, that they always focus on one killer or one sort of murder event. They present a psychological portrait of the killer, which increases our distance to him or her. Usually it's him, right? The distance from the killer is created with graphic descriptions of the crime itself. So there's tension between, you're drawn into being close to the killer, but you're also distanced morally because of the horrifying things that he or she has done. There's a 4-part structure to the text which mimics that of classical detective fiction, where it goes murder, then backstory, then the investigation, and then finally the trial. Most true crime books end with a trial or, well, it used to be an execution, not so much anymore, but they end with trials usually, although sometimes these quickies are rushed to print before anything's really ever happened. There's lots of context, social, historical, political, personal, psychological, right? Lots of sketching in of the details of these people's lives. Many techniques are borrowed from fiction so that these real people are made more interesting, more dramatic, more appealing somehow. And that's when writers sometimes get into trouble. You know, people have been sued for misrepresenting real people in true crime books. There's a focus, an overwhelming focus on the figure of the psychopath. And from the 1970s on, there's an overwhelming focus on sexual crimes as well. Now, let me just talk about films a little bit. True crime films borrow and use a lot of the same techniques that the books sort of invented. But of course, they add the audio-visual elements that, you know, amp up the drama and make it, you know, funner or more interesting to some people. You know, there's an audio-visual sort of cachet that you don't get reading Bugliosi's book about Charles Manson versus seeing a depiction of Manson on the screen. The rise of the psychopath really begins with film. And by rise, what I mean is the development of the psychopath as a kind of American icon, right? This figure develops this almost mythic and symbolic proportion that contains a lot of our fears about what crime is and who experiences crime and how. So the three major forms of film, of course, are documentary, and in this genre, docudrama, or mixture of documentary with reenactment, and then there's the truth-based fiction, which is a more thorough mixing of fact and fiction. There are some films that I wanted to tell you about. The first one was many of these books were made into films, of course. The original 1968 version of In Cold Blood is a wonderful film. And it stars Robert Blake, thank you, yes, who has recently been in some trouble, right? But he was an unknown in 1968. He was, Richard Brooks, the director, wanted total unknowns. They filmed that movie, and this is what makes the movie so powerful and eerie, frankly. They filmed the movie in the actual home where these murders occurred. It was a family murder, mother, father, two teenagers in the middle of a small town in Kansas, middle of the night home break-in kind of thing. It's a very powerful movie. Another early one, The Boston Strangler, starring, of all people, Tony Curtis as the Boston Strangler. He gives an outrageously good performance. There's a remake of that is not worth seeing. See the original. Next we have Helter Skelter, the story of the Manson events, the made-for-TV movie, which is one of the best, which aired first in 1976 and scared the hell out of my generation. I know that. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, 1984 or 6, I believe. This is when true crime begins to critique itself. With this film, it's very loosely based on the lives of a couple of actual serial killers who have kind of been discredited in terms of how many people they killed. You know, any person murdered is terrible, but they were going around saying that they had killed hundreds of people, and the FBI believed them for a while. Turns out they were big liars, right? But anyways, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, invites the viewer to actually witness one of their crimes, and then turns the camera on the viewer and sort of implicates the viewer in this violence. It's a very powerful film, and it's very controversial because it is told with a lot of moral flatness. There's no judgment in this film. It's just, Henry is just a serial killer. It's just what he does. It's a job like any other. So it's a controversial film, but it's worth looking at. Natural Born Killers, of course, tried to do the same thing in asking the viewer why we want to watch this stuff. In my view, that film failed in its intent, but it's still a good film. It's not based on anything real, but it does ask these critical questions about media implication and why we want to watch this stuff. Paradise Lost is a documentary that has raised serious questions about these three kids are in prison for the murder of three young boys in a small Arkansas town, and it raises questions of, you know, the corruption and perversion of justice and bias against these three kind of loner kids. And finally, well, not finally, but we've got Monster, the treatment of the Eileen Wuornos story. Kind of, that film humanized Eileen Wuornos in a way that the media coverage of her did not, right? And Zodiac, interestingly, from 2007, is a film that doesn't talk so much about the killer, it talks about the people who are dealing with these crimes in the newspaper in San Francisco, right? So it's about really the making of a book about the killer. That killer was never caught. So, you know, that's part of the reason why they couldn't make it about the killer. But there's a definite trend within true crime to sort of to develop some sort of meta-fiction, some meta-nonfiction, really, in terms of looking at the production of these stories, looking at how they're made, and looking at the effects of murder on communities and people who experience it, rather than just sort of glorifying the killer and demonizing the victim. So there's some of the most interesting films in this genre. The Manson films, there have been many, of course, and I read them as a kind of cultural barometer in terms of the changes in murder narration through time. So in the early 1970s, we had this amazing, very balanced documentary that is very hard to get your hands on, but you can get it on the internet, actually, but it hasn't been released. It's a very balanced telling of that story, oddly enough, because the story just became wackier and wackier as time went on. 76, I told you about that. There's just some other pictures of Manson. There's a movie called Manson Family Movies, where the sort of Manson worship, which is a very, you know, questionable part of pop culture, people who are into Charlie Manson, that's an outgrowth of that, right? Same with Charles Manson Superstar, although that is kind of a straight documentary that attempts to set the record straight, but it excuses Charlie Manson from his, you know, implication in the crimes that he took part in, or that he directed, really. You know, he never actually killed anybody, right? But he told those women and men to kill people. So he's the Svengali, right? The Manson Family in 2003, another retelling of the story, but with the added aspect of a sort of critique of Manson worship. It's a very interesting film. And then why this happened, I don't know. In 2004, yet another telling of Helter Skelter on TV. It wasn't worth seeing. And as a TV critic at the time said, come on, let's have a different story about these events, right? Let's have a story about, how about the girl Linda Kasabian, who did not go to prison? She turned state's evidence. She's living a life now. Why can't we hear about her, right? So I feel the same way, that, you know, the Helter Skelter story has been told too much, and we need to be telling ourselves a different story about it now. In terms of documentary film, The Thin Blue Line, directed by Errol Morris, released in 1988, introduces a very innovative use of the reenactment. Reenactments normally are used to sort of fix a moment in time and to show what actually happened. Errol Morris, by showing multiple versions of the killing of a policeman in Dallas, which that was the crime this story is about, through multiply reenacting that crime, he calls the truth of what happened into question. It's a very famous film, and not just for documentary filmmakers for those reasons, for the technical dimensions of it, but this film actually played a crucial role in releasing the man who was wrongly convicted and serving jail time for killing that police officer. Not that one, that's, you know, that's the film, but the cop who was murdered, the guy who was sitting in prison for it, Errol Morris, basically got him freed because he made this film about the case. In terms of true crime on television, I probably don't need to tell you all, but there's tons of it, right? Cable TV networks are just filled with these shows. Unsolved Mysteries is not on anymore, but it was the first. It was the forerunner of this genre. America's Most Wanted has been on for 21 years now. They tried to pull it in the mid-90s, and there was such an outcry that, you know, people want that show to exist, and it does. Forensic Files focuses on, you know, the scientific approach to true crime, dealing with forensics. 48 Hours Mystery is a kind of, that's on CBS. That's a sort of primetime, tabloid-esque. You know, each week you get one new crime, and there's got to be something interesting or weird about it. The one I'm most interested in is a show called The First 48. Have any of you seen this show? A few of you have, okay. This show is a real innovation in the genre because what it does is it counters the assumptions that we have and the sort of preconceptions about what American murder is, and it shows the seams of the standard murder narrative in mainstream media by presenting victims whose lives aren't shattered by mystery or serial killers, but, you know, the ordinary, unfortunately everyday, tragically mundane aspects of real murder. So what true crime does is it hypes murder. It focuses mostly on white victims, mostly on white women victims, attractive white female victims, right? The First 48 deals with what's really happening out there. So it reveals issues of race and social class in murder that we really don't get in mainstream true crime depictions, and highlights the mundane and non-sensational circumstances of most murders. And I want to show you a little bit of this show because I think it really so this show is based on the premise that homicide detectives, basically there's a statistical reality in homicide work that states that if you don't have a good lead in the first 48 hours after a murder has occurred, your chances of solving it drop by 50%, right? So that's the premise of this, is they follow homicide detectives for the first 48 hours and see what they come up with, right? And sometimes they get leads, solve the case, sometimes they don't. And they go to places in America that we don't usually see on television. These smaller cities, there's a lot of these from Memphis. We're going to see Search for the Suspect. They really show the mundane aspects of what it's like to be a homicide detective, which is a lot of boring stuff, actually.
In Memphis, Sergeant Mundy Quinn and his team are working the murder of 23-year-old Robert Clay.
We're going to see if we can locate him. It's probably going to be hanging low right now.
They try to make it a little dramatic, but it's not. It's driving down the road in Memphis.
We're arriving on the scene here in a second. Here it is. Would you mind if I looked around real quick to make sure he's not here? What? That's Brandon. What are you doing? Where's Raphael at? Why are you hiding over there?
I'm thinking I was going to do something to me.
Why are you hiding?
Because I got scared. I didn't even know who y'all was.
Mr. Raphael
I
here.
promise you, I ain't, sir.
Where's he at?
I do not know, sir. I've been here ever since last night since I left you.
If Raphael comes over or you see him, you need to call. He needs to turn himself in and save your family the embarrassment of having his picture put all over the
Embarrass me, though.
Well, it might embarrass the rest of your family. Let me call Ron. Yeah, man, Brandon was hiding in the closet. He was hiding in the freaking closet. He saw two strange guys knocking on the door.
I didn't know who it was.
We're not the rent man.
And they have to say that, right? He's being held, but he's innocent until proven guilty. Okay. So I wanted to show you just another little bit about this detective, Caroline Mason.
In Memphis, 28-year-old Mario Hampton was shot while in his car. Sergeant Caroline Mason has identified a suspect, Adrian Todd. Now, she just needs Adrian to confess.
Let me tell you something. You're not in here for infidelity. You're in here for murder. Okay? I'm not gonna bring you in here if I don't know what I'm doing. You're my last resort. By the time I bring you in here, I know what I'm doing. I already have you. I have enough to charge you right now, with first-degree murder. I took Detective Woods in with me to be the bad cop. I was going to be the good cop since I lured him down here, but he pissed me off because I hate being jacked around and sitting there while you talk to me, lying to me, making me think I don't know what I'm talking about, and, his cool little smirk on his face. So I had to take
Caroline Mason is one of the stars of this show. She does a good cop and a good bad cop. So it's just.
You're not here because you had a girl in your car.
She starts swearing at him, so we'll skip that. It's about the presentation of a kind of criminal reality that is much more in line with what murder actually is and what homicide detectives actually do. They talk to people. That's the work of homicide detection. And this show is wonderful because it follows them as they go around and talk to people. It's not high drama. It's not, shootouts and chasing suspects. I mean, there's some of that, but it's very mundane. And I just think it's great in terms of a depiction of homicide that counters these stereotypes we have about it from watching too much true crime. All right, so I'm almost done. The last thing I'm going to tell you about is internet true crime. There are many blogs that deal with true crime. There are lots of really lurid and horrifying things out there, but there's also some good stuff, and these are a couple. This woman, Laura James, is a blogger out of Detroit. She has a site called Clues, C-L-E-W-S, and it's more historic true crime. She collects older cases, and she's really sort of comprehensive and intelligent and very critical of the genre as well, although she is a fan. This blog it's called the Homicide Report. It's a chronicle of every single murder that happens on a weekly basis in Los Angeles. Similar to the first 48, this is a website that really tells the story of what real murder is. It's about gunshot victims. It's about young men of color, unfortunately, in our society. And she always says she's a reporter for the LA Times, and in these blurbs about each person, she gives the race and the means of death. And that is very important to her. She's criticized. People on the comments page will say, why do you talk about race? Why are you telling us the race of these victims? And her response is, why does the report talk about race? She wants to present an accurate demographic picture of who is at risk of dying from homicide in LA County, right? She's countering the myths and some of the powerful impulses in journalism that sort of, if it bleeds, it leads kind of thing. The more outrageous and strange a homicide is, the more ink it's going to get in the paper or coverage on a blog or whatever. So she's actively working against that. And she's saying, look, homicide is not Lacey Peterson. Horrifying story, yes, pregnant woman killed by her husband, but the statistics are telling us a very different story about murder, and she's telling that story. She's not telling the one about the missing or murdered white woman of the week that you'll get on, some of the tabloid cable news stations. So this is a great website. She's also got a visual interface, a map, a murder map of LA County. And you can see these sites, race, ethnicity, age, gender. It's overwhelmingly male, gunshots, and men of color. Days of the week, Thursdays and Saturdays, overrepresented here. She also talks about killings by police, which some people take issue with. There is another one who's doing a similar thing in New York. His site is called The Murder Book. This is a guy who, he used to work for the Daily News, so he's got much more of a tabloid sensibility. And he's a true crime writer. He works for 48 Hours Mystery. He hypes himself a bit, but he is doing a pretty good job of covering New York City homicide and compiling statistics and doing these monthly reports and so on and so forth by neighborhood, by type of murder. This story, an ongoing one that true crime doesn't deal with in any kind of appropriate way. The majority of women murdered in 2008 were victims of their partners, right? It's about domestic violence. So, there are some people out there working in true crime who are telling different stories. And this guy is one of them. So what I want to leave you with is the idea that although it deals with reality, true crime is much more invested in fantasy and the projection of a specific notion of what homicide actually is. And that idea has serious consequences in terms of our public policies, in terms of criminal justice outcomes, and in terms of us ignoring homicide that really happens, right? So that, true crime is actually closer to fiction than we would be led to believe. So that's what I have for you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murley. I am certain that you will be happy to answer some questions.
Yes.
And I'm certain we have a lot of questions. Now, for the people from the community who are here, this is an example of the quality of the instruction that we have at Queensboro Community College. A lot of people think community colleges are about teaching the very basics that are necessary for somebody to get a job. And in fact, our college has a tremendous depth in terms of its faculty, and there are all kinds of interesting and relevant courses that are taught at our institution. I think Dr. Murley is a good, vivid example of what we have in our faculty core. So with that, are there questions from the audience? Back there. If you can yell.
Jerry Mattacat, I teach the history seminar series here in Continuing Ed. I have a question. The latest true crime that I've seen on CNN and Fox and everywhere is Mexican cartels. It's so prevalent that my wife is worried about going anywhere. You know, we're not going to Tucson, we're not going to El Paso, we're not, because of Mexican crime cartels.
Yeah.
And how they are shown in the American television. I'd like to ask the question, number one, how are they shown in Mexican television? And is there any difference there than what they're showing here in CNN, et cetera? And number two, is this another part of the true crime setup that this cartel situation is really a lot different than what is being portrayed on the news stations at this time? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. Unfortunately, I don't watch Mexican TV, but you know, if I did, I think what you'd see is, number one, a lot more graphic violence being shown. I have seen Mexican true crime magazines that are incredibly gory. They really have no strictures about showing gore. In terms of the way that those stories are being told, this is another instance, you know, I believe, although obviously there's a problem there, right? That there's clearly a lot of criminal violence happening. The fact that your wife is fearful is a result of the way the media is covering this, right? The same thing happens with a lot of bad things that happen, right? So, you know, I don't really know how different the coverage is in Mexico. But, you know, because true crime is a sort of global phenomenon, it's probably pretty similar, and it's probably very sensationalized and pretty graphic. But I'm not exactly sure.
And how is it on CNN that you've seen, obviously CNN, and their portrayal of it? Does that fit into your thesis of the true crime setup? That they're only showing us the, you know, we see Anderson Cooper next to a fence, you know, ready to get his head blown in.
Right, right.
But, you know, he's all ready for, meanwhile, he's only got his cameraman there, but he's
Right.
ready for this Mexican cartel to jump over the fence.
Well, I mean, I think that the way that story is being told on CNN, for example, feeds into our fears about immigrants generally, right? And is sort of displaying in a very graphic way fears about Mexicans coming here and bringing this to us, right? And laying this violence on our doorstep. And so it kind of, you know, creates more paranoia about immigration and the like. That's what I think. Yeah.
I'll be the arbiter.
Okay.
I'm Michael Feiner. I'm a former English major from many, many years back from college. And I remember in my college days, we read for our English test Helter Skelter, and I recall that it was based on the Beatles song Helter Skelter. And one of the songs from the album was "I've Seen a Little Piggy Standing in a Row," and how they filmed according to that. And I also remember one of the classes I took was a transformational grammar course where they actually diagrammed the sentences according to the cadence of Helter Skelter, the albums and the Beatles albums. And my question is, do they still teach about that in English classes in college today?
I wish. That's great. I can't believe someone actually, someone was teaching Helter Skelter in a college class. I teach true crime sometimes in the mystery and detective fiction class, but otherwise, not so much. Not so much. Yeah.
People that produce this stuff, are they trying to exploit us, or do we want to be exploited?
Well, it's both, right? It's both. It's a chicken-egg question.
Which is worse? Society, every society.
I don't know. I mean, we are the media, right? We produce and sustain and support and consume all of these things. Whether you as an individual do or don't, you know, plenty of other people are obviously into this stuff. So I don't know which is worse.
When people producing some kind of, some kind of feathers on it.
I mean, you know, I once talked to this guy, Paul LaRosa, who, he's the author, the blogger who does the murder book, and he's a producer for 48 Hours Mystery. And, you know, I asked him, who's your audience, and do you have any moral qualms about doing this stuff, right? The Nielsen ratings, you know, they're flawed, but that's the information we have about TV viewing demographics. Women in their mid-50s and 60s are the largest consumers of 48 Hours Mystery. Women generally are the top consumers and supporters and fans of true crime, right? That's something I talk about in the book. Read the book to find out why. You know, on the moral qualms issue, he sort of sketched out. He said, well, you know, this is what people want to see. This is, you know, I'm doing this for a job. You know, I'm trying to do the murder book to counter some of these negative, you know, these moral quandaries that we get into around telling the story of murder. But, you know, he couldn't really be honest about it, you know, and he, to his credit, he said, you know, I try to tell stories that are going to have some sort of beneficial social effect. He said, I try not to concentrate on the, you know, the horrible domestic murder that, you know, just is going to serve for some sort of perverse thrill or something. And, you know, he said he does his best, but it's within a very constricted, very conservative milieu, and these individual actors can't do a whole lot. I fault them, though, for being part of the system. You know, you don't have to take a job at 48 Hours Mystery to buy a huge house in Park Slope, whatever, right? But that's my, you know, commie perspective on it.
About 2 more questions.
Chapter 1 in all of these, whether it's a book or a movie, would be the crime itself.
Yes.
But as Paul Harvey would say, and now for the rest of the story, how do they deal with the result of the trial? Because sometimes you have a despicable murder, and yet the person goes free. Lizzie Borden.
Well, they choose. Right.
Do these books deal with the second chapter of this situation?
Sometimes they do, but mostly they don't. And the reason for that is it's very conservative genre, and it's about reordering the chaos that has been wrought by crime. So we want the neat, tidy endings. We want the killer to end up behind bars, right? And the true crime writer knows that and chooses cases that fit that criteria, right? There are some people who tackle these ambiguities. The guy who wrote Fatal Vision, Joe McGinnis, dealt with the Jeffrey McDonald family killer case. Jeffrey McDonald, you know, was free for a lot of years. He's behind bars now. He may be freed again because of another book that's been written about his case. But he sued Joe McGinnis for telling the wrong story about him, essentially. So, you know, they choose their stories very carefully.
One of the subgenres that you haven't mentioned but might be of some interest here is like the atrocious and seemingly senseless crimes of like massacres like Virginia Tech or Columbine. How is that handled in the true crime industry?
It's handled in a similar way. You know, that there's such an outpouring of media around those crimes that there's lots of hype and misinformation, and you know, it's about the generation of paranoia and fear for all of us, right? I mean, it is true that these things happen, but again, the way that the stories are told make all of us feel at risk to a degree that we don't really need to feel, right? So they get the same treatment essentially, and it's kind of sad, kind of pitiful. You know, there needs to be more imagination here and more truth-telling, I feel.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Now, let me ask a question, and please join us for a reception, and you can continue with your questioning of Dr. Murley as in a personal manner. But how many of you remember Carl Sagan?
Yeah.
There you go. Well, mark your calendars, because in October we're having the new Carl Sagan. This guy happens to be a physicist, not a cosmologist, but his name is Meiko Keku. He's one of the originators of the string theory, and he is a tremendous speaker. And mark your calendars, because that's the next presidential lecture at Queensboro Community College. Thank you.